wanted a comeback that screamed power, polish, and reinvention, but instead, one single sentence turned the entire Harper's Bazaar moment into a viral humiliation that critics are calling the clearest proof yet that Meghan Markle never really left the palace behind.
I've had enough. Clapping for herself. That last part was on brand.
Why would you do that? That's not necessary.
Imagine spending months carefully planning your image reset. Every pose calculated, every word filtered, every aesthetic detail curated to perfection, only for the entire internet to fixate on one tiny awkward detail that makes everything else look staged. That's exactly what happened when Meghan Markle's glossy Harper's Bazaar feature dropped, and what was meant to feel like a triumphant return instead spiraled into one of the most dissected interviews of her post-royal era. The energy was clear from the start. New era, new tone, new Meghan. The photos were dramatic, heavy, almost cinematic. She's sitting on floors, wrapped in oversized coats, hugging herself like she's carrying the emotional weight of the world, staring into the lens as if she's about to deliver a monologue about destiny. It wasn't light. It wasn't breezy. It wasn't casual. It was intense, almost too intense. And that's when people started whispering, why does this feel so forced? Why does it feel like we're watching someone perform depth instead of naturally embodying it?
That in their cover feature, they actually screw you over in such dramatic fashion that you may end up being stripped of your royal title.
The styling didn't read empowering to critics. It read calculated. It felt like a production, like every angle had been rehearsed 10 times before the camera even clicked. And once viewers sense effort, too much effort, something shifts. Authenticity becomes a question mark. The glossy language of the article didn't help. The journalist described her arrival, her presence, her expressions in near ceremonial tones as if she were still orbiting within royal mystique rather than simply attending lunch in New York. Every detail felt elevated beyond reality. Every quote felt like it was meant to echo. It stopped sounding like a conversation and started sounding like myth building. And then, halfway through the article, one detail detonated the entire narrative. Meghan arrives at a friend's townhouse in New York. Normal setting. Private home. No red carpet, no flashing cameras, no state banquet, just a quiet living room. And yet, according to the article, as she walks in, she is formally announced as Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. Not at a gala, not at an official function, in someone's house. That single sentence changed everything, because suddenly the moody photography and poetic descriptions didn't feel artistic, they felt like evidence. Evidence, at least in the eyes of critics, that the royal identity she publicly stepped back from is still very much front and center. And the internet does not let moments like that breathe. It zooms in, it rewinds, it replays. Who gets announced like that in the living room? Why is the title still echoing in private spaces? If this was about independence, about freedom from expectations, about building a new life, why does the formality still linger?
It is really hard with her and her, I would say, lack of brand. It sounds fake.
The perception shifted instantly. The comeback narrative cracked. Instead of discussing her projects or philanthropic ambitions, the conversation narrowed to one blunt viral question. Who announces someone like royalty in a private house? And that question didn't just trend, it spread. It became symbolic. To critics, it wasn't just awkward. It was revealing. It looked performative, like someone clinging to the aura of an institution they've repeatedly described as restrictive. And perception, once it hardens, is almost impossible to soften. Then Candace Owens entered the scene, and when she reacted, she didn't treat the interview like a celebrity misstep. She treated it like confirmation. Confirmation of a narrative she has been pushing for years. She zeroed in on that living room introduction like it was Exhibit A. If you said you wanted a normal life, she argued, why keep the grand title energy in a friend's townhouse? No ceremony, no diplomatic function, just a quiet room, and yet Duchess of Sussex. The contrast was too sharp to ignore, and when Candace framed it that way, the moment exploded further.
It makes you sound like really kind of into yourself in a way.
It's her trying to look glamorous and dewy, the big eyes, the hand on her chin, the slow head turn. Oh, on the couch, on the settee, with the silk dress, staring into the camera.
Who gets announced in a private house? That line became a meme. It became a punchline. It became shorthand for everything critics believe doesn't add up. Why keep using a title from a monarchy you no longer serve? Why insist on independence while leaning on the very branding that built your global recognition? Whether fair or harsh, that debate ignited with fresh intensity. And timing made it worse. As this feature circulated, images of Catherine, Princess of Wales, attending calm, understated public appearances began trending side by side. No dramatic staging, no theatrical introductions, just polished simplicity. And the internet loves contrast. On one side, moody poses, ceremonial language, formal titles in private rooms. On the other, relaxed events, smiles, organic engagement. Critics sharpened their commentary. One looks natural, one looks staged, and once that narrative took hold, it ran fast. The conversation drifted from one awkward article to a bigger, more uncomfortable question: has Meghan's brand stopped evolving? Candace pushed that angle harder. She argued that every project circles back to the same storyline: pain, misunderstanding, being silenced, reclaiming a voice. In the beginning, that narrative felt bold, brave, necessary. But repetition can be dangerous. If every glossy feature echoes the same themes with new lighting and new couture, audiences begin to feel fatigue. They start asking where the growth is, where the shift is, where the proof of forward movement lives beyond interviews and aesthetics. And once audience fatigue sets in, even small missteps feel amplified. Another layer intensified the scrutiny: consistency. Meghan has spoken about stepping away for freedom, yet the Duchess branding remains constant. On covers, in headlines, in introductions. To critics, that doesn't signal empowerment, it signals contradiction. And contradiction in the public eye is gasoline on commentary. Candace summarized it bluntly: you can't position yourself as harmed by an institution while simultaneously benefiting from its recognition. That statement, whether you agree or not, struck a nerve because it simplified the debate into something easily shareable. It wasn't about the photos anymore. It wasn't about fashion or tone. It was about perceived hypocrisy. And perceived hypocrisy spreads faster than praise ever could. Then came the sharper jabs. Claims that the interview felt self-focused, that it read like myth-building rather than grounded reflection, that it framed Meghan as eternally misunderstood instead of actively evolving. And underneath it all, the living room announcement echoed louder than any carefully constructed quote. It became symbolic, the moment critics felt they saw the gap between words and optics, and that gap is where reputations wobble. The fallout didn't stay contained to one magazine cycle. It started shaping broader conversations about her brand trajectory. Is she repositioning or repeating? Is this reinvention or recycling? And perhaps most cutting of all, does she see how certain moments land with audiences who are no longer automatically sympathetic? Candace didn't invent those questions. She amplified them. She held up the article like a mirror and suggested this is how the world is interpreting you, not as a liberated figure carving a new lane, but as someone still orbiting a title that carries more weight than the project's meant to define her independence. And that is the sting. Not the mockery itself, but the sense that the mockery resonated. Because the internet doesn't laugh unless it recognizes a pattern. The Harper's Bazaar feature was supposed to feel like a reset. Instead, for many viewers, it felt like confirmation. Confirmation that despite oceans crossed and interviews given and institutions criticized, the Duchess identity remained central. And once that perception crystallizes, every future appearance carries the shadow of that living room scene. The formal announcement, the pause, the question hanging in the air. If this was meant to close a chapter, why does it feel like the same page being read again? The problem wasn't just that people laughed, it was that the laughter felt inevitable. Because once the living room announcement became public, every other detail in that Harper's Bazaar profile started looking different, sharper, louder. Suddenly, the moody poses weren't artistic, they were theatrical. The poetic language wasn't flattering, it was inflated. And the Duchess title wasn't incidental, it was central. That shift in perception is brutal when you're trying to engineer a comeback, because perception doesn't just critique the moment, it rewrites it. And now, instead of remembering the quotes about growth or ambition, audiences remember one image: Meghan being formally introduced in a private New York townhouse like a visiting dignitary. Critics began arguing this wasn't a random detail, it was a pattern. Duchess of Sussex on covers, Duchess of Sussex in interviews, Duchess of Sussex in brand bios, and now Duchess of Sussex echoing inside someone's living room. The repetition felt deliberate, and deliberate repetition in public branding sends a message, whether intentional or not. Candace Owens leaned hard into that idea, framing the moment as symbolic of something bigger. Two people who stepped away from royal duties, but never fully detached from royal identity. And once that framing took off, it spread fast because it was simple. Simple narratives win online. You can't say you want freedom from the palace while recreating palace energy in private spaces. That's how critics summarized it. Fair or exaggerated, it stuck. Another uncomfortable layer started creeping into the conversation: brand confusion. Meghan often speaks in sweeping terms: impact, change, voice, purpose, big words, big tone, big vision. But critics asked a blunt question: where are the tangible milestones matching that scale? They looked at interviews, interviews, podcasts, streaming projects, photo shoots, and argued that the achievements didn't feel proportionate to the grandeur of the presentation. That disconnect, real or perceived, fueled more skepticism. Because when the presentation feels monumental, but the results feel incremental, audiences notice, and they talk. And when they talk, they don't whisper. The fatigue factor made it worse. Early on, many people were curious, sympathetic, engaged. They wanted to hear about identity, about pressure, about navigating old institutions in a modern world. But by the time this feature landed, some casual observers were expressing exhaustion, not outrage, exhaustion. They felt like they'd heard the same themes before: pain, misunderstanding, reclaiming voice, healing. And while those themes are powerful, repetition without visible evolution can turn empathy into impatience. Candace captured that shift with a ruthless clarity. If every appearance circles back to how hurt you are, eventually people stop seeing resilience and start seeing stagnation. That line circulated fast because it struck at the core of the fatigue argument. Timing continued to work against her. While the Harper's Bazaar spread leaned into heavy styling and symbolic framing, Catherine's public appearances were trending for the opposite reason: simplicity, calm, effortless composure. No elaborate introductions in private rooms, just visible engagement in public settings. Side-by-side comparisons multiplied across social media, and once comparisons take hold, nuance disappears. One looks grounded, one looks staged. That's the binary critics built. And binaries are powerful because they eliminate complexity. The conversation expanded beyond Meghan alone. Prince Harry inevitably got pulled back into it, because every time the Duchess title resurfaces prominently, it reconnects him to the same monarchy he has openly criticized. The more the title appears, the harder it becomes to sell the narrative of full separation. Headlines tying them to royal branding reinforce the connection, whether strategically useful or not. Critics argued that this creates a loop, stepping away publicly while remaining symbolically tethered. And loops are dangerous in storytelling. They prevent forward motion. Then came the harsher interpretations. Some commentators described the interview as self-mythologizing. Others called it overproduced. Words like performative, calculated, over-curated started popping up repeatedly. And repetition of criticism is its own amplifier. Once a descriptor catches on, it attaches itself to every future project. That's how branding shifts. Not in dramatic explosions, but in accumulated impressions. And the living room announcement became shorthand for that accumulation. It wasn't just a detail anymore, it was the symbol of perceived contradiction. One comment that circulated widely captured the sting: trust is built in drops and lost in buckets. For some viewers, this interview felt like a bucket moment, not because of one title alone, but because it reinforced doubts they were already carrying. Doubts about authenticity, about growth, about whether the narrative was moving forward or circling itself. And when casual observers start saying something doesn't add up, that's when reputational erosion quietly accelerates. It doesn't trend with fireworks. It settles like dust. Candace's harshest framing reduced the situation to one sharp image: someone still thinking like a duchess in a world that has recalibrated. She suggested the embarrassment wasn't that critics mocked the moment, it was that the mockery felt familiar, that audiences were already primed to see it that way. And that's what transforms a minor PR stumble into a warning signal, because a stumble can be recovered from. A pattern is harder to escape. The most uncomfortable question hovering now isn't about Harper's Bazaar specifically. It's about trajectory. If every reinvention leans on the same aesthetic, dramatic poses, elevated language, emphasis on struggle, does it truly count as reinvention? Or does it reinforce the idea that the core brand hasn't shifted? Critics argue that if Meghan wants a genuine reset, it requires subtraction, not amplification. Fewer ceremonial flourishes, fewer symbolic gestures, less reliance on the Duchess title in intimate spaces, more measurable action, more visible evolution, less myth, more grounding. Because here's the paradox that keeps resurfacing: the more carefully she appears to manage perception, the more tightly critics say she traps herself in it. Every glossy spread becomes another test. Every introduction becomes another lens. And every time the Duchess title echoes, audiences flash back to that townhouse scene, the quiet room, the formal announcement, the question that refuses to die. Who gets announced like that in a living room? The Harper's Bazaar feature was designed as a power statement. Instead, it became a referendum, not just on styling or writing, but on identity, on consistency, on whether independence and inherited branding can coexist without contradiction. Some supporters will argue the criticism is overblown, unfair, even obsessive. Others will say it's long overdue accountability. But what cannot be denied is this: that single line in the article overshadowed everything else. It became the headline beneath the headline. And now every future appearance carries that shadow, because the internet remembers symbols more than speeches. It remembers moments that feel out of place. It remembers contrasts. And right now, the contrast between stepping away and still being ceremonially announced feels like the unresolved thread in Meghan's ongoing story. The question isn't whether this controversy fades. Controversies always do. The question is whether the pattern changes before the next glossy cover arrives. Because if the same ingredients resurface, the heavy framing, the elevated tone, the Duchess branding, the reaction may not just be laughter. It may be indifference. And indifference is far more dangerous than mockery. More dangerous than mockery. More dangerous than mockery. More dangerous than mockery.